Hello, Year 10. We hope that you're all coping well and it's good to actually be talking to you. The scheme of work that you're starting this week and this first lesson is designed to focus on GCSE Language Paper 1 skills. And Paper 1 is a paper that uses a fiction text for Section A reading. Then you write your own fiction text for Section B writing. So this first lesson is an introduction to reading fiction. By the end of the lesson, you should be clearer about what we mean by fiction, and you'll also have had your first understanding, your first introduction to some top tips for reading fiction. So just to repeat, the lessons have been designed to support you with the reading fiction elements of GCSE English Language Paper 1. It's intended to help you develop an appreciation for the wide range of literature that you'll encounter in the exam, as well as building your confidence in the assessment requirements. Using the PowerPoint in lockdown. It's suggested that you save the PowerPoint, but that you also take notes from it. You can do that on a Word document, you can use paper, you could use your English book. There are NTS parts, notes to self, that are useful for returning to and revising from. These should focus your mind on what you don't know or what you need to address in order to make progress. So what do we actually mean by the word fiction? From the following list, decide which text types are fiction or non-fiction. Autobiography, diary, short story, novel, news report. So if we look at the definition, that fiction is novels and stories that describe imaginary people and events. You probably worked out that we were talking therefore about short stories and novels. Now, some of you might have put down or considered that a diary could be fiction, and you're absolutely right that there are some fictional diaries. Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Diary of Adrian Mole, but of course these have been created by somebody, they've been made up, therefore they are imaginary people and events. Just to remind you, of course, that the opposite of fiction is fact. So an autobiography is about one person's life, their own life, the auto bit. A diary is usually personal recordings of thoughts and feelings and events, first person, and a news report is factual and informative. These lessons are based on 8 fiction text excerpts or complete text from the 19th, 20th and 21st centuries. In the exam, paper 1, you'll be tested on 1 fiction text from the 19th, 20th or 21st centuries. If the paper 1 text is from the 19th century, then that means that the paper 2 text will be from the 20th or 21st centuries. Even though you don't actually have to guess the century of the text that you'll be examined on, we're just going to consider the idea of looking for vocabulary clues, if there are any. We got to Leatherhead without misadventure about 9 o'clock, and the horse had an hour's rest, while I took supper with my cousins and commended my wife to their care. So this is an extract from one of the stories that you're going to be looking at in more detail in the next few lessons. And all the following extracts are also from short stories you'll be reading. So if we look for vocabulary clues, we've got misadventure, which is perhaps quite an old-fashioned or archaic word, meaning disaster or calamity. And we've got commended. Now, it's not to say that the word commended isn't used in modern day or the 20th century. However, in this sense, commending somebody into someone's care, passing them over, handing them over, entrusting them, it's perhaps a little bit more old-fashioned or archaic. The next one, guess the century from the style of writing. The ancient house looked down on them indifferently. Its garden side was plainer and severer than the other. The long granite front, with its few windows and steep roof, looked like a fortress prison. So we might consider what vocabulary clues give away that this is 20th century as opposed to 21st century. We've got that hybrid word, two words put together perhaps. A hybrid word meaning a cross between a castle, fortress and a jail. Would a 21st century writer use that? Probably unlikely. And the final extract. Just before midnight, I set off to walk back to the club. My route was the old one, but this corner of London had changed a good deal. Fleet Street no longer housed the hot metal presses, and many of the old alleys and courts had long gone, most of them bombed to smithereens by the Blitz. Now, you might have wrongly guessed the 20th century because the Blitz was mentioned, and this would be a context detail. However, even though it dates the text as being set in the Second World War, it is in fact written in 2014. So remember that you might read a fiction text that's set at a different time than it's actually written. And of course, you can probably think about novels that you've studied as part of literature or in years 7, 8 or 9 that would fit in with that. So we've first of all got some top tips for addressing an unseen fiction extract before the exam. You might want to pause the PowerPoint at this point, just have a read through on your own first. I'm going to go through them in a bit more detail next. First one, experiment with what works for you in timed conditions. Should you skim and scan the text to get an overall understanding, followed by a close read, or should your first read be a close read? Skimming and scanning are reading techniques that use rapid eye movement and keywords to move quickly through text for slightly different purposes. Skimming is reading rapidly in order to get a gist, an overall view of the material. Scanning is reading rapidly in order to find specific facts, so you'll probably be looking out for key words that are in the question. So at this point, suggesting that you write a note to self. Now, you might already know that you're going to start with close reading. You might already know that you will be starting with skimming and scanning, or you might want to put a question down. Keep it short. Close reading or skimming and scanning, question mark. Because of course, the next few lessons will give you more experience of different texts and what to do with them. Therefore, you could make that decision at a later stage. Now, this next one is a really crucial one, especially at this particular point, because you do have time on your hands to fill in some gaps. And I would strongly suggest that you take advantage of that. With regards to word classes, or another way of expressing that is grammar, or parts of speech, or syntax when we talk about the ordering of words in a sentence. So we're talking nouns, verbs, adjectives. Do you know what they are? Can you identify them in a sentence? Do you know what the function of each is? If you don't, or if you're a little bit hazy, you need to remind yourself, then we've got supplementary worksheets that go along with this first lesson, this first week's lessons. I strongly suggest that you give them a go, even if you think you're already 100% confident. And then we've got figures of speech. So, do you know the difference between similes, metaphors, and personification? Again, there are supplementary sheets to help you out with these. If you think they're ridiculously simple, well, absolutely brilliant, because that means that you've reinforced that you're very strong and secure on your terminology in that particular area. So, if you could write yourself a note to self, pause the PowerPoint perhaps, what do you need to focus on? You might even at this point want to pause and have a look at some of the sheets that are supplementary material with regards to filling in some gaps. You've got a really good opportunity to fill in some gaps in terms of subject terminology. So I strongly suggest that you complete the sheets, either after the PowerPoint or later in the week, or you might want to stop and do it now. Find ways to work out the meaning of unknown words. In the exam, you won't have access to a dictionary, you won't have access to a thesaurus, so you need to develop plans, strategies for working out what unknown words could mean. You can look at the word in context, how it's used in a sentence or how it's used in the paragraph. And this is particularly where having a good understanding of word classes will help you, because if you're not familiar with the word, but you know it must be a verb or you know it must be a noun or an adjective, then that's going to help you work out the meaning. Another tactic is deciphering, working out the meaning through the prefixes and suffixes. So just to clarify, a prefix is the bit of the word at the beginning. For example, the prefix un, meaning not. The suffix are the letters at the end of the word. So prefix, the bit at the beginning, suffix, the bit at the end. And there is a supplementary sheet on prefixes and suffixes. So again, pause the PowerPoint, write yourself a note to self. What tip are you going to use? You might use both of them. Are you going to work out meaning of words from context and therefore improve your understanding of word classes? Are you going to learn the meaning of more prefixes and suffixes? So I'll just reference again that supplementary sheet. And what it asks you to do, it gives you a list of prefixes, a list of suffixes, and it asks you to devise at least one word for each prefix and each suffix. And an extension task linked to that is to use each one in a sentence. And if you want to do more work on prefixes and suffixes, very, very easy to find those. Just Google those and you'll find lots and lots of worksheets out there.
Do you fancy any chicken nuggets or a cheeseburger?
I don't know whether you picked up that slight interruption, which I was going to record over, but I thought it might be a humorous interlude where I was just asked, do I want chicken nuggets or a cheeseburger? There you go, Year 10. I hope that's not made you too hungry. Anyway, I declined the offer. There we go. So, next top tip. Use extracts or complete short stories to get used to appropriate texts. If you're intrigued by the start of a story, then read it. The other activity that's part of this lesson is reading a short story. And the short story is called The Monkey's Paw. We're just going to have a quick look at the introduction, or rather the first part of the story, because it sets up character from the outset if we are prepared to be literary detectives. And what I mean by that is that when we're reading a story, because a short story has to be more economical than a novel, in other words, it doesn't have as many words to use, the writer is going to deliberately use subtle ways of getting across the character or characters. So we should be looking out for clues quite deliberately. Let's have a look at this. Okay. Should have had a chance to perhaps read through the first bit. I'll read it out. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlour of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical chances, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. So if you look at the box underneath on the left-hand side, if we read between the lines, what can we deduce about the father by the way he plays chess? So if we use our scanning skills, we find the word chess and then look at the words around it to see what it says. And then the second question, that right-hand box. If we read between the lines, what can we deduce about the mother through the choice of the word placidly? Now again, going back to earlier, we've got there the suffix ly, which, as I said to you earlier, shows us it's an adverb, therefore describing a verb. In this case, an adverb that describes a verb. I'll give you a few seconds to have a think about it before we look at the next PowerPoint frame. So this opening shows the father is shown to be impulsive and takes unnecessary risks by his behaviour of taking chances and risking perils. In contrast, the mother is seen to be passive, placidly, yet observant. Now, if there are any of those words that you don't understand, impulsive, perils, chances, passive, placidly, observant, again, you might want to pause the PowerPoint, look them up in the dictionary, add to your vocabulary. And if you know them all, then again, it might be worth pausing the PowerPoint anyway, because it's time for a note to self. What are you going to do? Well, a suggestion there, you're going to focus on making more deductions, reading between the lines when noticing the actions of characters and the ways they are described. You can write a shortened version of that if you want to. These next top tips are for suggestions in the exam. So, I'm not going to read them out this time. Well, not immediately anyway. Okay, if you haven't finished reading them yourself, I'm not really giving you that much time, you might want to pause the PowerPoint and have a little read. So I'm going to read them through and briefly explain each of them. Top tip 1. Read the title and any introduction to the text carefully. It is surprising how many people, how many students don't realise that the writer gives the story a title for a reason. It can help us understand the story. It can be a clue to what the story is about. And then on the exam paper, you will always get an introduction. Again, you get clues. If we keep thinking along the lines of this idea of being a detective and looking for clues, being a literary detective, then this will make a lot more sense. Bullet point 2. Take your time to read the extract carefully. If there are sentences or paragraphs you simply don't get, or your nerves are getting the better of you, read them again. Highlight keywords in the question. Highlighters are your friends. Bullet point 4. Ask yourself questions about the text as you read. Who are the main characters? What have you found out about them? Where's the text set? What's actually happening? Can you identify the genre, the style? Is it detective? Is it romance? Next bullet point, think about the voice of the text. If it's first person narrator, how do you picture them? If it's third person, is there an attempt to guide you towards a certain viewpoint? Or is the narrator unbiased and neutral? Even during your first read, be looking out for interesting linguistic features, similes, repetition. Look out for structural features like the narrative shifts. In other words, it might start from one character's perspective, then it changes to another character's perspective. Structural things such as outside to inside, narrative or storytelling to dialogue, speech, or flashbacks where it goes back in time. As we've already mentioned about unknown words or words you've not quite understanding, if you're uncertain what a word means, but don't use it as part of your analysis. And that seems like an obvious one to me, but you can't analyse something you don't understand. Make sure you use short quotations. They support your writing, they prove your points. And make sure you're highlighting and making notes on the exam paper. You might find it helpful to jot a word or two next to your highlighted sections. It might be a technique you've noticed. It might be an effect of a technique that you've noticed. The top tips for the exam that we've just gone through will make more sense when we complete the lessons or the text over the next few weeks. To finish, what I'd like you to do is reduce those tips to keywords, which in itself is a good technique for exams. Reducing a lot of information to less information. I've done the first one for you. So it goes from read the title and any introduction to the text carefully to read title and intro carefully. We get rid of the, we reduced introduction to intro. Next one. So I've done them all for you, but I suggest that you do them yourself because it will focus you on the top tips and you will remember them. But if you're struggling, you can cheat. Don't just go for the easy option, by the way. And you can look at how I've reduced them. You might want to reduce them even further. Okay, we're reaching this final frame now, and it's a time to reflect. Reread the notes you've made. Go over this PowerPoint at a later point so you reinforce the top tips provided. Have a look at your notes to self and aim to address those. For example, learning more prefixes and suffixes. Read the complete story of The Monkey's Paw. Apply some of the techniques and the top tips suggested to help you to understand that story. And of course, just to refer to once again these supplementary sheets, the prefixes and suffixes sheet, and the other sheets that hopefully will address some of the gaps in your learning. If you've got any questions about any of the activities in this week's work, then of course you can email your English teacher or you can email me, Miss Hughes. Once again, I hope you're all keeping well and I hope that you enjoy the scheme of work that starts this week. Take care.